welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Entertainment Network. I am your host, Sarah. I have another great author interview to bring you today. I hope that you are having a great day. As we get started, I would like to remind you to like, subscribe, follow on whatever platform you are listening and or watching this podcast on. It really does help us to get this podcast out to more readers, such as yourselves, and your support is always appreciated. In another way of support, if you are so inclined, is to go to gsmcpodcast.info. You can see that next to me there. gsmcpodcast.info. You can leave a tip or donation. That really helps the show. It helps the entire network, actually, to get more content out. I'm not sure if you've ever looked into the GSMC Podcast Network, but we have around 800 podcasts, and we've got a variety of topics. There's lots of audiobooks, there's classic radio shows, and then we've got our GSMC originals as well, in a whole bunch of topics that might be of interest to you. So definitely look into some of our other podcasts, and if you are interested, it is very helpful if you go to I put my head the wrong way. If you go to gsmcpodcast.info, you can leave a tip or a donation, and I thank you in advance for any kind of support that you are willing to give. Thank you so much. As we get started, like I said, I hope your week is going well. My birthday was on Friday, as I mentioned in the last episode, and had a quiet but a very nice day after I finished putting up the episode. We did some things in the office. My hubby and I went for a 5-mile walk with the dogs, which was great. It was beautiful. The weather has been amazing the last few days. It's supposed to get, let me put this in air quotes, colder by the end of the week. And by colder, I mean today was 82 or so, 81, 82, and it's supposed to be 69 by Friday. So, not really cold, but colder. So we went for that walk. It was beautiful. And then a couple of friends came over and we made pizza and we played Cards Against Humanity and just laughed and talked and had a wonderful day. And then the rest of the weekend was quiet as well, and I can't complain about that. Did my author interview, of which you are about to see, and spent a very quiet day on Sunday cooking and hanging out with the hubby and the dogs. So good times. And now here we are. I hope that your weekend was as good and that your week is off to a great start. As we get started, I will say that I don't know where I was going with that sentence. As we get started, let's get started. The author that I am speaking with today is author Garnett Kilberg Cohen. Let me get that image up for you so you can see Garnett and the image of the book. There you go. There she is. And it's not a great author photo. I love that's from her website, and I just think it's wonderful. And then the title of her book is Cravings. It is a collection of short stories. Let me go ahead and give you the description of that book. Again, this is Cravings by Garnett Kilberg Cohen, Opening with hors d'oeuvres and closing with a feast, the stories in Cravings pulse with longing, missed opportunities, recriminations, and joy. Garnett Kilberg Cohen leads readers through acutely crafted explorations of the way events shape and change our lives, sometimes for the better and sometimes in ways that haunt us forever. Love, friendship, childhood, parenthood, and leaving home, all of these experiences of desire, driven by the unrelenting passage of time, form the heart of this charismatic collection. Kilberg Cohen's captivating and vulnerable characters often recognize their shortcomings and past mistakes, but cannot always rise above them. One woman learns to forgive her husband's ex. Another fears her love of salty snacks caused a family tragedy. A stoic rural community drives a newcomer out of town. A young man's entire life is colored by a traumatic childhood event at a zoo. Focusing on the specific, unforgettable moments that reveal our connections to one another, Cravings offers an expansive vision of humanity that lingers long after the final page is turned. And so again, that is Cravings by Garnett Kilberg Cohen, and it's fun because two not in a row, but 2 weekends in a row, I've spoken with an author who writes short stories. And as you know, I've had a complicated relationship with the short story in the past, but they are definitely, I'm learning to appreciate them so much more. And whereas last week's book did have some connections in the story, at least in the area that they took place, they all took place in or around the area that the author is from. These don't have that connectivity of place, but they all have that connectivity of desire, or the main characters seeking something, wanting something, and how that shapes and alters their lives, their experiences, etc. They are a variety of different lengths. We talk about that a little bit in the interview, and I really appreciate the complexity of the characters. Garnett's really able to bring characters to life in with their nuanced and layers. And so, like I said, I appreciate the complexity of the characters within the confines of a short story. She really does a great job at bringing out those details and making those layers nuanced with the characters. So I really appreciate that. As always, if you're a fan of short stories, you should definitely check out the collection. But let's go ahead now and turn to the interview. Again, if you haven't figured it out already, the book is Cravings. The author is Garnett Kilberg Cohen, and I'm going to go ahead and start the first segment. Hi, Garnett. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you for being here. I'm excited to talk to you about your collection of short stories. Before we do that, though, if you wouldn't mind taking just a few moments to share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you.
Okay. Well, I would say the main thing is about me is I've always been a writer from the time I was quite young. But in my professional writing career, I got a bit of a late start because I had a baby when I was very young, 18. So I didn't finish college until my late 20s. But I've always done some kind of writing. I was a newspaper reporter for a while for a weekly newspaper. I was a copywriter for an ad agency. And our main client was Tombstone Pizza. So I ate a lot of pizza. And I was I wanted to be a writer, but I wasn't sure what kind. And I was sort of fishing around and then settled on fiction writing because I think it had the most latitude, I think, of all the types of writing.
Okay, makes sense. I talk to a lot of people who come to fiction writing from journalism or something along those lines. So it's very common, and I'm sure any writing helps. So it's always good to have those different skills. The book is called Cravings. It's a collection of short stories. Can you just talk about the collection a little bit? What was your inspiration for it? Where did you start?
Okay, it's short stories, and there it is. Oh, I don't think you can see it that well, but all right, never mind. But each story had a separate inspiration, and they were written over a fairly long amount of time. And for example, one of the stories in the book was inspired by a news story I saw about a boy who fell in a gorilla pit in a zoo. I don't know if you remember that story.
I do. Yeah.
And I wondered what it would be like to be him. And I knew nothing about the situation, but I just imagined what it would be like to be him and have his life afterwards. So sometimes they're inspired by something like that, sometimes by a memory, sometimes by an image I see. But putting it into a book, I have a lot of short stories that aren't in this book. I try to find ones that had sort of a common theme to put together into this book. And what worked for a long time on the title before it came up with Cravings. But every story, someone, generally a main character, wants something, wants to know something, or wants to have something.
Yeah. And I think the first story, when I started reading it, I thought, oh, cravings, that makes a lot of sense. That first story with the young girl and her food cravings. And then the other stories they might not be quite as obvious, but yeah, what you said, everybody does want something. So you talked about a little bit of where your inspiration comes from. When you sit down to write a short story, do you usually just have that starting off point, or do you kind of have the whole arc of the story in mind? How does writing short stories work for you?
I usually just have the starting off point, or I have something I want to write around. And when things are going really well, at some point in the story, something happens that surprises me. And that makes the characters become real and alive. And then the story takes off. I don't usually know the endings when I start. I have from time to time, but usually it feels more authentic to me to go through the process of what's happening to the character. But when something takes me by surprise that the character does, then the character becomes real for me and the story really takes off.
Yeah. And just a ballpark, how many words generally is a short story? Is there a ballpark, or is that different for every story?
Ballpark. It's, I would say 5,000 words.
Okay.
And short stories, and one of the reasons I say that is I publish a lot in literary magazines, and a lot of times literary magazines have a limit of 5,000 or 6,000 words. And there's different forms of short stories, longer ones too. But I generally feel that that's about what it takes me to really develop a character in a situation and bring it to some sort of resolution. So I would say about 5,000 words. I have one I just finished, a story I just finished yesterday, and it's 4,300 words. So
Okay. And I ask because there's one story toward the end of the collection that's much, much shorter than the others. So I think it's called Jump, if I'm remembering
yeah,
correctly. Can
that's
you talk a little
correct.
bit about that one?
That one was inspired by a photograph I saw. And it was two little girls with a jump rope in an alley somewhere, or back behind factories. And I just wondered about the little girls' lives and how they happened to get to the place where they were. And and I liked the girls and I liked the story, but it didn't move beyond it didn't move beyond whatever it is, probably 600 words or something along those lines. And there is a whole category, as I'm sure you know, of short stories called flash fiction, and those are usually 1,500 words or less.
Okay.
And then there's longer forms. The last story in the book is the longest story in the book, called Feast, and it's one of my favorites. And it could be, with a little push, it could be a novella, but it's still in the short story range. I mean, there's not a solid rule, but
Right. I realized as I was reading the collection and then again as Garnett was speaking that I don't think I've ever asked an author, or nor have I looked up the standard, if there is a standard, which there apparently is not a hard and fast standard for how many words a short story should be. I guess I've just never looked it up. So this is why I love this podcast, because I get to ask authors questions and I get to find out things that I didn't know, or I maybe didn't even know I should look up. So I love learning new things. It's time for our first break of this episode. When we come back, we will be talking about um, how Garnett knows when a short story is complete or not, and we'll also be talking about character development. So stay tuned. You are listening to and or watching the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to work, cause my boss is a jerk, and I'm not even that paid. I need a change in my life, cause I don't feel alive, and there's nothing that makes me happy. Hold my beer for a minute, I'm about to quit my job, cash in for a ticket. I'm going on a trip and I don't plan to visit. I'm gonna stay there till I feel like I'm winning, and this is just the beginning. I need a big change, help me feel like living. I need a big swing, home runs I'm hitting, and I'll never look back, moving on till I get it all. And we all got dreams, we all want things, but what you gonna do for it? How you gonna move for it? What you gonna be? And do you believe you can do anything?
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Garnett Kilberg Cohen about her short story collections Cravings. Before the break, we were talking about the length of short stories and how that can actually vary quite a bit more than I really had ever thought about. So again, love learning new things. As we get ready for the second segment, I just want to remind you once more that if you are a fan of this podcast and you would like to do more than just liking and subscribing to the podcast to help it get out to more readers such as yourselves, you can go to gsmcpodcast.info, as you see in the graphic next to me, and you can leave tips, donations, and help the podcast get out again to more readers such as yourselves. Once again, I thank you for all of the support that you have given me over the years and any support that you choose to give me in the future, whether that's a like, a follow, a subscribe, a comment, a review, or going to gsmcpodcast.info and leaving a tip or a donation. Thank you so very much. We are going to go ahead now and return to the interview with Garnett. So let me get that going for you. So you must have to really rely on just your writing gut, if you will, or your writing intuition to know when a story feels complete to you. Is that accurate?
That is completely accurate. It's a lot of it's instinct, but I have a general feel in my mind for the feel and shape of what a particular story should be, given the character, the situation, and how it's moving for me as I get into it.
And you mentioned that you usually have the jumping off point, maybe not the ending. So what about character development? I would assume maybe characters develop as you write?
They do usually develop as I write. And that, of course, as you know, is really important because the character needs to be believable and authentic. And that's where I find a story might fail, is if the character is not becoming real to me and separate from me. I want to feel like the character is a person. And of course, there are autobiographical elements, but I want the person to be separate from me. I mean, those two little girls in the story Jump, they were nothing like me. They weren't there for long, only about 600 words, but they were nothing like me. The girl in the first story who wanted the olive, she was a little like me. But then when she changed and became someone I didn't really know, that's when the story took off more for me.
And is there one story in particular that is more autobiographical, or that they're just elements of you throughout?
I think there's elements of me throughout. And I don't think anyone could write fiction and not have some biographical elements, because you might just be writing something, someone goes in the hospital and you think, oh, when I was in the hospital, I remember seeing this. So it doesn't always have to do with the story, the situation, but it just something you remember that you use for verisimilitude or something. Mm-hmm. I guess sometimes when there's a story, and this isn't autobiographical at all because it didn't happen, but the story Ogden, Ohio, I know I was a teenage mother in a very small town. So some of the things are autobiographical. The story itself never happened, but I drew on elements from that particular time in my life.
Yeah. And I am glad that some of those elements did not happen to you. There's some drama in that story, but
yes, there is some drama in that story. Thank you.
but also, yeah, I grew up in a very small town and understand that that there are definite aspects of life in a small town that you don't get other places.
What state was it where
I
you're
grew up in Montana, in Western Montana. So
Oh,
my
wow.
hometown is about 1,000 people. My husband refuses to believe that. He insists that there's nowhere near 1,000 people. But that's what the census says. So
no, I believe you. My brother lives in a small town in Montana.
oh, where does he?
Yes, so
And there's actually a story set
story.
in a small town in Montana. Was that based or kind of
That
inspired?
was inspired by my brother and inspired by being, and I have to say, small towns are all alike in some ways, but a Montana small town is different from an Ohio small town.
Mhm.
And I was sort of fascinated by the people in his small town. And again, the story's fiction, but small towns just have this world of their own, and where it's a whole world.
And yeah, there's always different characters that are very interesting in small towns. Now, my husband grew up in Ohio, so we have had conversations about small town Ohio versus small town Montana. So,
Oh,
and
funny.
there are definite differences. So there was the Montana connection, and then you have a story with a kind of a secondary character, but a little girl named Risa, and my youngest niece's name is Risa. So those were the two stories. This was the first time have encountered a Risa in fiction. So she's 13 and she was very excited that you named it. There was a character.
I'm sorry the character had kind of a tragic circumstances, but when I was a little girl and I read stories and read books, I kind of like characters with tragic circumstances. They seemed glamorous at the time to me when I was young, before I knew the reality of
Right.
things.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah. Any particular types of research that you did for any of the stories that did you learn anything interesting through research?
I'm trying to think if, I always do a little tiny bits of research while I'm writing. But they're really, because I don't write historical fiction and I don't write fiction way out of the realm of what I personally know. I don't usually have to do a lot of research. But for instance, when I wrote the story about the boy who fell in the gorilla pit, I looked up silverback gorillas, and I didn't need most of that information, but it made me feel like I was being a little more authentic than I would have felt otherwise.
Yeah.
I haven't looked it up. I'm trying to think if any. Oh, and I did the story with Risa. I did look up different diseases to see what disease would be close to her. I didn't want to give her a specific disease, but I wanted it to be in the realm of being real. You know how in old novels, people sometimes have these really mysterious feigning diseases or something that you read now and you think that couldn't have been real. But so I wanted at least to seem sort of real, connected to something.
Yeah. Do you write longer forms of fiction as well, or mostly short stories?
I write mostly short stories, but I also write nonfiction. These days I write almost as much nonfiction as fiction, and I've published that pretty widely, but I don't have a book of nonfiction yet, because most of my pieces of nonfiction are short too. They're, around the same length as my short stories. So I have to figure out a way to shape some of them and get them into a collection. I have been working, I have a novel I discarded, and I've been working on a novel, but because until just May of last year, I was teaching full time. The only time I ever had to work on it really was the summer. And then at the end of the summer, I just kind of it would just kind of disappear. And I never, so I'm hoping to get back and start restart this novel that I was working on. But I will say my favorite form of fiction is the short story. But I also know that the favorite form of many readers is the novel. So, and I would like to have a novel. So I'm going to try and get back into that soon.
Yeah. What about short stories do you think draws you to writing in that format?
Things about short stories. I think that when I think of a novel and it's telling the story of a person or people, there's this arc, and that's supposed to cover the main part of a person's life or a huge event. But I think the way our life is really made up, or people's lives are really constructed, are in stories. They're episodic. They don't, there's periods in your life that are very intense, and periods in your life that something happens and everything centers around that thing that happens. And if, for instance, if there's a death, there might be a 3-month period where everything centers around that death. But in a novel, it's like, it feels almost like the whole life centers around the arc. It makes it seem like that's the main event of the life. So I think it's a truer form to representing people. But at the same time, I love the compression of it, what you can do with language and how you can experiment with a short story. You can experiment with a novel, and you can use compressed language in a novel too. But it's almost required in a short story. So right. That's what I like about short stories.
Well, you have to compress it because you're trying to get your point conveyed. You're trying to get the feel and the heart of the story conveyed in a much smaller space. So you can't take paragraphs and paragraphs to describe, a tree.
Yeah, or the person can't just go to the mall and hang out and have nothing happen and go home. Right. Not that happens in many novels I know of, but
sometimes you're reading a novel and you think, was there an editor that thought that this 4 pages of whatever it is was necessary? I sometimes wonder.
And I do read novels sometimes and find myself like skimming a few pages, but you can't do that with a short story. Or if you do, you realize you got to go back and reread it because you missed something.
Right. But sometimes it's also nice to have a short story, especially a collection of short stories, because you can sit down, you might not have a lot of time, and you can read the entirety in one sitting, and you can then go about your day, and you've completed it.
I agree with you. I feel it's really satisfying to complete something. And I kind of look at my days, and that's how the days seem worthwhile. What things did I complete? Did I do exercise? Did I write? Did I call someone I've been meaning to call for a long time and haven't done it? And reading something like a short story, I can feel really good about that. I finished that short story and I can go about my day thinking about it. So that's good too.
I've been laughing because in April so far, my interviews have been, I spoke with another short story author last Saturday. And then on Sunday, it was epic fantasy. So that was 3 books totaling over 1,800 pages. So I had short stories and then epic fantasy, and now short stories with you. And then next weekend again is epic fantasy. And that book is over 1,000 pages for just one book.
Wow. So and do you read the whole thing? Do you read the whole 1,000
I'm
pages?
working on it.
Okay.
But I'm very grateful that I also had short stories interspersed in there. It kind of gives your brain a different kind of rest.
Yes, I completely understand, because when I taught, sometimes I teach novels or I teach other things, and a short story. I also like short stories because you can read them twice. And usually, when you start a short story, you don't know why the stuff that's happening at the beginning is happening. But then if you've read very carefully, you might know at the end, but you might have forgotten the beginning. But if you go back and read it again, it's like, when you see a movie a second time,
Mm-hmm.
you think, oh, I missed this in the opening the first time, but this is clearly foreshadowing this, or this is clearly a symbol of what happened. And it's nice, it's lovely to make those connections. I love making those connections. And you almost need to read it twice. And it's a lot harder to read a 1,000-page book twice.
Yes. Certainly not back to back.
No, yes,
Yeah.
certainly not.
Okay. I can think of one time in my life, at least one time, maybe there's more, but I can think of one where I did read an 800 or 900 page book all in one sitting, just in the course of the day, because it was the end of a series and I'd been waiting for it forever and I was so excited. And then because I read it so fast, I read the last page, sat for a minute, turn to the first page. So I did read a 800 or 900 page book back to back, but this is not my norm. And I'm not upset with long books. Just sometimes when you're trying to do author interviews and you've got lots and lots and lots and lots of pages, 2 weekends in a row, it adds up. So I'm not dissing next weekend's author. Please don't get mad at me. Don't send me nasty emails about how I don't like long books or whatever. I don't know. Let's take a break, okay? We're going to take that break, and when we come back, Garnett will be talking about how she approaches short stories, the writing of short stories in terms of publication. Are they part of a collection? Does she write them for specific publications, etc.? So stay tuned. You are listening and or watching the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Garnett Kilberg Cohen. Before the break, we were talking about reading short stories and reading novels, especially in this case, epic fantasy, as we were talking about, and just the different ways that you might approach reading a short story collection as opposed to reading a very large novel, and how short stories, obviously you can read them out of order. You don't have to read straight through a collection. You can read a short story and then immediately go back and read it a second time. So a different way of reading, which can be good, different ways of engaging our brains, right? So let's go ahead and return now to the interview with Garnett. When you write short stories, are you usually, you mentioned you publish in a lot of literary magazines, those sorts of things. Is that usually your goal, or do you do you write stories that you are specifically thinking of for a collection? Or talk to me a little bit about that process.
Right now, since this collection came out in October, I've written 3 short stories. I'm just finishing, and I don't have a particular goal in mind for them. I'm thinking when my time frees up a little bit more, I'm going to get back to the novel. But I've had some inspirations for them, and now that I have 3, I'm thinking, maybe I need to think about getting these in a collection. But my goal is always just on the piece I'm working on. And and getting it published someplace really good where I know people will read it or it might get some attention. And but I also realize at this stage in my life that there's like 4 places where you will get attention in the whole country. I mean, you get attention in 100 places if you're just looking to get attention from the writing world and not people beyond, other writers and editors. But there's only like 4 places that people will come across your stories who are not writers. I mean, I had a nonfiction piece, a short nonfiction piece in the New Yorker. And the morning that came out, I just got emails from people who were non-writers. I saw your piece. And I thought that doesn't happen when it's a really good literary magazine. That doesn't happen. So that was really nice. But there's also this thing about writing in a kind of obscurity that frees you up a little bit. I mean, if you get in a good literary magazine, it's very nice and you can give it to people and show it to people. And if you're in academia, like I'm not now, but you get credit for it and all of that. But it's not quite the same as just people saying to you, wow, I saw this. I found this on my own.
Yeah. You were trying to show the book earlier, and I will have it on screen for the
Oh,
people who
okay.
are watching, which will be gregreat. But your cover art, and I was looking at your website before the interview. Your cover art is always a little it's different than some of the cover art that I see right now that's out. So do you have input into your cover art, or how does that creative process work?
Some input into I've had some input into all the cover art except my first book. And this one, they did a cover which was very nice for the book. But it had a child on it. And I wrote, and they sent me the cover art and they said, blah, blah, blah. And hope you like it. We think this is the final. And I wrote back and I said, I like it. I like the art, but I just don't know if we want to have a book with a picture of a child and the word cravings on it. And they agreed with me right away. And I said, there's a lot of parties in the book. Maybe there could be a picture of a party on the cover. And the cover of this book does have a party that's in the book. It's not captured exactly how it's presented in the book, but it's similar to how it's presented in the book. And at one time because there are a lot of parties in the book, I was going to call the book The Landscape of Parties or something like that. And then I changed it to Cravings after talks with the publisher and all of that. But I've had some input into the covers, but not a lot. So
yeah, I always project my own emotions on that and wonder how much I feel like I would potentially have to very, very consciously let go of not being able to control the whole process.
Well, I know, and I did, even with this cover, which I liked very much. When I first saw it and I saw the woman on the front, I thought, well, I don't have short blonde hair and a beautiful long neck like she has. And then I thought, this is fiction. You don't want it to look like you on the cover.
Right.
Yeah, I would say I've had to let go of something with every cover, even though I've had input in all of them.
Yeah. Are there any other writings that you would like to highlight during our time together?
I suppose you could look at my writings. You could look at my website, which is Garnett Cohen author, and there's a few writings on that there's links to a few writings on that. And there's links to my other 3 books on that. So those books could be purchased from the website as well. But right now I'm not particularly thinking of anything other than the books I have out or the selected writings I put on the website.
Yep. Okay. You mentioned at the beginning that you've always written, and you know, throughout your career, you've written in various capacities. So what was the final thing, or what was that moment where you thought, you know what, it's time now, I'm going to try to write, in this case, fiction, for publication?
I guess I was talking about small towns again. I was a reporter at a weekly newspaper in Ohio, and it was my second year there. And, not that much happened, but it was the same events the next year that had been my first year. There was an ice cream social. There were the fire department go out and test their hoses, and you cover all these things, and it's the sameness of them, which wouldn't be true in all journalism at all if you were in a different place. But the other thing that bothered me was I would quote people, and I thought of things they could have said that was better than what they said. But I was really aware that I wasn't allowed to just make up quotes and put them in the newspaper article. And so I was feeling really constrained. And then I was beginning to question myself. Did they really say that? Or did I make that up? And I thought, this is not working for me anymore. I always sort of wanted to write fiction, but I was just thought I would be just as happy as a journalist, but I really like making things up. I think that's what changed. Yes.
Well, I'm glad that you decided to go and write fiction and not create a scandal for yourself.
Yeah. It would have been a small scandal since I wasn't a small town paper, but it wouldn't have been like one of those big ones where somebody's made up a whole story and it's in the New York Times or something.
Right.
But still.
But it would have been a small town, and everybody would have known, and everybody would have talked about it.
And as we said earlier, there's a world of its own in a small town. So yes,
absolutely. We still have 5 minutes left in this session, but we have a few more questions. So why don't we go ahead and log out and log back in, and then we don't have to rush through the final questions.
Okay. All right. So I will leave, and I'm going to hit leave, and then I'll come back.
Yep. Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
When you take time to read, just for you, what are your favorite authors and some of your favorite genres?
As I mentioned, I like short stories. I really love Alice Munro. She has short stories that just you're reading along and it pulls the rug out from under you. You go down and then it pulls it out again. And I love the way the connections are made in her link stories, particularly Beggar Maid. I liked Olive Kitteridge, the connections made. She's not a very pleasant character, but you will read a short story that's whole and stands completely on its own. And then the next story in the book will stand completely on its own. And there will be a reference to a character that occurred in the first story, which works perfectly well in the story you're reading. But you know so much more about that character because you read a whole story about the character. Jennifer Egan, also Visit from the Goon Squad. And I really like to read, mysteries too. I like it if they're slightly more literary mysteries than, just page turner mysteries. But I think mysteries, a lot of times the authors really work on the plot. And that's something I don't pay that much attention to when I'm writing the plot. but I think you have to have some sort of structure or scaffolding to see something that's so well plotted as some of the mysteries I read. I think just kind of internally helps me with having some kind of structure that's more than I might naturally move toward.
Yeah. I love hearing what authors are reading. One, because my TBR list is clearly never long enough. But also, two, I love hearing what authors are reading because I love hearing about how what they're reading can affect or influence what they're writing, and not maybe influence in terms of plot or characters or stories along those lines, but how they write or how they develop characters or how they develop their plot. So I think it's fascinating. Hopefully you do too. We are going to take our final break of this podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking about, I'll be talking to Garnett about her advice for aspiring authors. So stay tuned. You are listening to and or watching the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with Garnett Kilberg Cohen. Before the break, I was asking about what she likes to read in her spare time, and the way she answered that question actually reminded me that I had skipped a question, and so we are going to pick up with the advice for aspiring authors question. Let me just restart that video. And actually, that reminded me, I skipped over a question when you were talking about scaffolding and learning from other writers. Do you have advice for someone who thinks that they might like to try their hand at writing short stories?
One thing I would say is don't worry about having a full idea. Just sit down and start writing. Maybe it's a memory, maybe it's an image. The short story, now the name is it's Wheels, that short story. And it's basically about an old man, but it starts with when the old man's a little boy and he's just pushing cars through dirt, you know how little kids do. And I have a young grandson, and I was watching him push his cars through the dirt. And I thought that's so interesting how so many boys do that, and, you know, kids, but boys in particular. And so I just started writing about that. And that took me to thinking, where do they go next? And with wheels and cars and bicycles and all of that kind of stuff. So don't put it off and think, I'll wait till I have a fuller idea, or I'll wait till I know what's going to happen. And when you're writing, if you get stuck, the two best things I think to do are either to read, because that always sparks ideas for me. It might just be a single word. Or to go for a long walk, because that's sort of meditative and gets your mind kind of moving.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. When you said small children pushing a car through the dirt, I was actually on a walk with my husband the other day, and there was a family near us, and they were speaking French, but the little boy had a tractor that he was playing with, and he kept saying vroom, vroom. And I thought, vroom, vroom. Apparently the little French boys say it too.
Yeah, that's exactly what my grandson would say. And sometimes he'd say it so loud, I'd have to go quiet down. But
Yeah.
but no, that is funny that it's the same in French.
Yeah, I learned something new. um, so we've mentioned your website and you've given that address, but if you can just remind people your website and also any social media that you're active on in case people want to learn more about you or your books.
I'm on Instagram, but I'm not that active on it. The best place probably to look, and you can contact me through it, is my website, which is garnettcohenauthor.com. And I think it's Garnett Cohen Author. I know it's Garnett Cohen Author. It's got to be .com is the next thing. But if you put Garnett Cohen Author in, you're fine. There aren't that many of us Garnett Cohens around. But I'm not that active on other social media. I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram. And on the website, I sometimes post when I'm going to have a reading coming up or something, but people can always contact me through the website as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Garnett, we've talked about a few different things, but is there anything that we have not covered that you wanted to make sure you had a chance to highlight?
Nothing is coming to mind right away. Except I just want to say thank you so much for reading the book, for having me on the show, and for reading it so carefully. I have been on now, because I'm promoting this new book, Cravings, I've been on maybe 8 podcasts, and I would say half of them, it becomes clear to me at some point that the person hasn't read the book, which is okay. I don't call them out on it or anything.
Right.
But I just love it when you said, well, when you make a reference to a particular thing in a story, and I think that's a podcaster who's doing her work. And she really, and the fact that you're reading 1,000-page books, that's
I'm trying.
But no, that's a real journalist who's doing the background information. Although somebody recently told me, Larry King never read the books of people who were on. But of course, he always had people had big scandals in their life. So he could just focus on their scandals instead of what they wrote. But I guess that's probably not what you wanted to hear about.
Oh, no, I appreciate it. Thank you.
I appreciate anything else. But I'm just excited that there are podcasts out there, that there is a new avenue, particularly as there seem to be fewer printed reviews. It's nice to have a new avenue. I am also, in the fall, I'm going to be review editor for another Chicago magazine, which is an online magazine. I've been an editor on of some kind, fiction editor, nonfiction editor, on a number of literary magazines.
Wonderful. Yeah, that would be, I would imagine that would be a different avenue, but still kind of helps you in that creative process, but gives you a different way of looking at writing.
It does. And one of the things I like about writing reviews I will mostly be assigning reviews, but is when I'm writing a review, is I so much more carefully read what I'm reading. I'm paying so much more attention to the sentence structure and everything else. Do you write?
No. I mean, yeah, a little bit, but not.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I'm definitely a reader. I've been a reader. I've always been a reader. So.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I want to say thank you for taking the time out of your day. It's the weekend, so I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about the short story collection and writing. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again to Garnett for joining me to talk about the collection and writing and everything else that we covered. I so appreciate it. As I said at the beginning, if you are a fan of short stories or you, like me, are evolving your relationship with short stories, then you should definitely check out this collection, maybe some of Garnett's other collections as well. And of course, you can go to her website and learn more about her, find where else you might be able to read some of her short stories, etc. So thank you to Garnett for joining me for this episode. Thank you as always to you, my listeners. It's such a pleasure to get to meet so many authors and to be able to share those conversations with you, my listeners, and now viewers. I really appreciate all the authors that I've met. I really appreciate you who have been with me since the beginning, listening for a long time, just listening, now watching perhaps. And I just as much appreciate anyone who is new, maybe who's just found the podcast and is getting to know me and maybe getting to know some new authors through this podcast. I hope that you will join me for the next interview. Let me just go ahead and get that set up. I will be speaking with author David Skidmore. This is epic fantasy, as I mentioned earlier when the conversation with Garnett. We are talking about his book Aelin. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's always interesting with fantasy if you're pronouncing words and names correctly. Aelin is one of the characters in the book, so I may or may not be pronouncing that correctly. This is the second in a series, the Ever Branching Tree series. One of the main characters is Aelin. The other main character is, I believe, this woman who is sitting by the fire. Her name is Megan. She is from our world. Aelin is from a different world, but of course those worlds collide as Megan finds herself thrust into a situation that she is not expecting to find herself in, and finds that she has abilities she never expected. So, if you are a fan of fantasy, you probably are hearing some of those tropes that you are familiar with and probably love to see in your fantasy. So I hope that you will join me for that conversation with David on the next episode. I'll be speaking with him over the weekend, and that will be up next Tuesday for the next interview. So please join me for that. In the meantime,
and actually,
if
that
you
reminded me,
I
skipped over a question when you were
if you are a fan of this podcast and you have not done so already, please like, subscribe, and follow on whatever platform you are listening or watching the podcast on. That is helpful. You can also leave a review. That can be written, it can be starred. It depends on, again, the platform of which you are consuming this podcast. Every little bit helps to get this podcast out to more readers and to people who are looking for new authors and maybe looking for new books and new series and or just love books and love authors and love the craft of writing. So thank you for that. You can also follow the podcast on social media. It is on Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok. I say it every week. I mean it every week. I love hearing from listeners. So if you are following the podcast, great. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you're reading. Tell me what you think of the interviews. Tell me if you've read any of the authors with whom I'm speaking, or maybe you were inspired to pick up a new book and a new author. So yeah, just find me. It's the podcast, but find me on social media and tell me what's going on in your reading life. I, again, hope that you are having a wonderful week. I hope that week continues to go well, regardless of what is going on in your week. I always hope that you have plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to